Welcome, everybody, to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and on today's episode, I'm very excited to welcome Michelle Waite to join me for a discussion about a film called The Great White Hope, starring James Earl Jones and Jane Alexander, released 50 years ago on October 11th, 1970. How are we doing, Michelle?
I'm good.
Yeah.
How are you?
Doing well. This is really exciting to have you on as a guest and to talk about a little bit more of an obscure film than we've looked at on the podcast so far. As we talked about a little bit before I started recording, this one's kind of hard to track down. It's not like an easy title to access anywhere you go, like on the streaming services and things. So I just wanted to start by asking, what role have movies played in your life? What maybe some of your favorite films growing up and or now? Like what role have movies played in your life thus far?
So I'm kind of a strange person as far as movies go. Well, maybe I'm not, but I think I am because I don't typically watch a movie more than once. And a lot of people do. There are some that I have, that I do watch and return to, but that's more out of nostalgia than anything. So like my favorites like from childhood are The Neverending Story, The Princess Bride, Stand By Me, which is based off of Stephen King's The Body, The Goonies, like Back to the Future 1 and 3, not the second one where he goes, that one's weird.
Okay,
I like the Western one in the first one, but not the middle one. And read all of those books too. So I think that is a connection for me, is like reading the stories and then watching the movies. And those tend to stick with me, but also they all have that same thread. Stand By Me maybe is a weird outlier because it's, we can argue if it's in the horror genre or not, but it's not his typical Stephen King horror genre, but there are darker themes, but they're all coming of age. They're all journeying on this coming of age plot in each of those in different ways, even if they, have fantasy elements or, like in the Gremlins or things like that, or in the Goonies. But I do enjoy those. And then like as an adult, I find, I am a big fan of action movies. Like the Fast and Furious is like my jam, and I would watch those over. And the reason I think that I like those the most is because they employ everything for me. So I get it all, a little bit of each genre. Horror is a little bit too scary for me, or sometimes just too gross. But I will watch them. But they're not like, like my favorite. Like, you get like a romance kind of story love line in the Fast and Furious, in action movies like that. You get some suspense, and the characters definitely change. You see a dramatic change in them and their relationships with other people. And so you kind of get it all in those types of, and it moves at a quick pace. So I think that's why I'm attracted to those, and can watch those over and over again. But my husband, like, he watches, I think he's seen like The Big Lebowski like 85 times, like stuff like that. So I've seen those because they're actually playing around me, but I don't really revisit. That's not my thing, to revisit a movie more than once.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I do revisit films, probably not as much as other film lovers, because there are so many movies out there to watch. It sometimes seems like a waste of time to rewatch a movie I've seen twice before. It's like, why not put on something brand new? I usually, after like the second viewing, I'll only watch it if it's for like a project I'm doing or something I'm writing, or maybe I'm with somebody who's never seen it and for some reason it comes up and I want to show it to somebody. But yeah, I agree with that. It's like, to just rewatch the same movie over and over, it's like there's just way too many great films out there I have yet to get to. So
yeah.
But yeah, so you mentioned the 80s films. I kind of grew up with those as well. Like, I think most of the films you mentioned were from like 84 to the late 80s, and that's obviously, a really important decade for those of us and at our ages. And the podcast is mostly about the 70s right now because we're starting in 2020. So the 50 years ago is 1970. So we're going to be in this decade for a long time. But I'm hoping, if everything goes well, to keep it going all the way into the 80s and talking about, so many favorites of mine then too. You mentioned Stand By Me, which I don't think a lot of people realize that that's based on a Stephen King novella,
Yeah.
because he's so known for horror. The Shawshank Redemption, same thing, based
Yeah.
on a Stephen King novella from the same collection, actually.
Yeah, from the same collection. Yep.
And a lot of people have no idea. They just think he does, the gruesome and the and the gore, but that's why he's my favorite author, is that he goes to different places. He doesn't just do the same thing
Yeah.
every time. So thinking of the 1970s, is there any films that you know of or that you've seen from this decade that have stood out to you, or that you've seen or that you know of? Anything from the 1970s that you like?
Oh, I would have to, I didn't come prepared to answer that question. So I don't,
Oh, that's okay.
no, I just don't know. Because I wasn't born until 78. So
Okay. Yeah.
I wouldn't really, watching movies. I'm sure that my parents watched things that probably,
Yeah.
Impacted me, but not really, like just wasn't engaging during that decade. So
Yeah, it's hard, right? If you're not, watching a lot of older films, if they came out before you were born, you kind of have to seek them out, right? So, some major titles from that decade you might have seen or heard of, like The Exorcist or Jaws or Star Wars or Close Encounters of the Third Kind or Halloween. And I'm a huge genre fan, so I love like the horror films of the 70s, which we'll definitely get to. But yeah, I was just curious if you had seen or know of any
yeah,
films.
yeah. I mean, I've seen Jaws, and I've
Mm-hmm.
seen definitely Star Wars.
Yeah.
Definitely not going to talk about Star Wars because I am not.
Speaking of James Earl Jones, right?
Star Wars and Star Trek, I don't want to get in that area. That is not where I need to go. I don't belong in there. Stick to what you know, kind of thing. But I do enjoy those. Did enjoy Jaws too, but just not as I guess familiar with those,
I've already joked with a couple other guests, like, when I get to Star Wars, like, how do I even do a podcast episode about Star Wars? It's like, now I'm going to go through the plot summary. It's like, okay, it's like, how do you even approach a giant movie like that?
Yeah.
The first big movie of the 70s to talk about for this podcast will be in March of 2022, when I get to The Godfather, which is, considered one of the greatest 10 films of all time. That came out in March of 1972. So I have a few months to kind of prepare myself, because that's another one. I'm like,
there's definitely some big ones that I guess I just don't associate with the 70s, probably because I watched them in the 80s or the 90s or as an adult. And so I don't even think about like when they were, written and unless I'm doing it like for an academic thing. And
exactly.
Definitely consider it.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I've talked about on here before, is sometimes it's like, where do you start? Okay, I want to go watch some older films. Like, where do you go to the 80s and 90s? Because I know my students, like an older film for my students is like, 2007. So it's like, right. Okay, oh, no, there were films like in the last century we can talk about. So whenever a student says a classic film from 2007, I'm like, oh my God, But yeah, films go back, more than 100 years ago. I could have done this podcast about, 100 years ago in film, and we could have talked about silent film. I mean, there are all sorts, but I love the films of the 70s, and there's so many I've never seen before. So I thought this podcast would be kind of a really neat way to make some discoveries, right? And to see some films I might not have ever had a chance to see before or since. So that takes us to our film today, which is called The Great White Hope. Now, I'm going to just give a little bit of plot summary about the movie. If you have anything to chime in, if I leave something out, I'm not obviously touching on every scene of the movie, but just kind of the general summary. And then I have a few pieces of background information too, like about the making of the film, like who directed it, who wrote it, and that kind of stuff. And if you have anything to add to that, feel free to do so.
Sure.
So The Great White Hope takes place in the early 20th century, and it stars James Earl Jones as Jack Jefferson, an African-American undefeated heavyweight boxer who fights his way to the top. He has lots of money, he has the title belt, and he also has a Caucasian fiancée named Eleanor, played by Jane Alexander in her feature film debut. This is not an easy time for Jack, since white people take issue with his being heavyweight champion, And then black people take issue with him having a white fiance. This is around 1910 or so, when interracial relationships were obviously highly controversial. Many of the white establishment are trying to arrest Jack for something, whatever they can arrest him for. And
Yeah, it's at the height of Jim Crow.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't find exactly like what year the film takes place. Everything I read online was like between 1908 and 1915.
Yeah.
So it was just something in that era. So what the feds do eventually nail him on is taking Eleanor over state lines for the purpose of like having sexual relations with her. Therefore, Jack and Eleanor flee the country. He tries to make a living as a boxer in Europe, and that doesn't work out very well. So he's forced kind of to take whatever jobs and fights he can get. In Mexico, he's cornered by the feds again, and a terrible tragedy makes Jack agree to a deal. He will lose his title to a white fighter, the Great White Hope, right? And they'll drop the charges against him. Will he lose the match on purpose? What's he going to do? That's kind of the question that's in your mind as we go into the last couple scenes. That's kind of like the summary I put together. Does that sound accurate, or do you have anything
Yeah.
to add?
Yeah. I think one thing, to mention is that it is loosely autobiographical about the real boxer.
Yeah.
And that there were several Great White Hopes. Like this was announced prominently, which seems very strange today from today's viewer perspective, that people would be like, this is going to be the Great White Hope every time that they box this African American man. So yeah
that was such an interesting way for the movie to begin. I thought it would start with maybe James Earl Jones boxing or something, like some kind of a montage, but it actually doesn't open with him, right? It opens with all the white characters and this figure that they think of as the Great White Hope. So some background info about the movie. So as you say, it was inspired by a true story. A boxer named Jack Johnson, who was a heavyweight champion between 1908 and 1915. So the original Broadway production, this film was based on a play. The original Broadway production opened October 3rd, 1968, and it ran for 546 performances, so it was very popular. And the stage play starred James Earl Jones and Jane Alexander on the stage. So Jones won the Tony for Best Actor in a play, and Alexander won the Tony for Best Featured Actress in a play. And then the play also won the Pulitzer Prize in Drama in 1969. So it was out, at the end of the 60s. This was out there. People knew of it, before the movie came along. It had already gotten some accolades and, on the stage and everything. As I said before, this was Jane Alexander's film debut. She is still acting today. I just saw her on I want to say 3 or 4 months ago. I watched her on an Amazon show called Modern Love. She had one of the main storylines on that. So she's still active today, as is James Earl Jones. I mean, at least a little bit. And the screenplay of the film was by Howard Sackler, the same man who wrote the play. He previously wrote, I thought this was kind of interesting. So Stanley Kubrick, the famous movie director, his very first feature film called Fear and Desire, which came out in 1953, is like a movie that Stanley Kubrick disowned. He didn't like it. He wanted every negative of the film destroyed. And who wrote that film? Howard Sackler. Like kind of like odd. Okay. Yeah. I'm sure Howard was thrilled by this. Don't destroy it, Stanley. He would also go on to write Jaws 2. So Howard Sackler had a kind of a unique career. He only has like 7 or 8 credits, and those are 2 other ones. The film was directed by Martin Ritt, who a lot of our listeners might not know, but he made some classic films like HUD, starring Paul Newman. He made Norma Ray with Sally Field. And he also made a really great film called Murphy's Romance, which came out in the mid-'80s, starring Field and James Garner. And so he made some really strong films over the course of a few decades. The Great White Hope received 2 Oscar nominations, one for James Earl Jones for Best Actor, and one for Jane Alexander for Best Actress. And that was all it got. It didn't get any screenplay or anything else. This would be James Earl Jones' only Oscar nomination in his long career, which kind of surprised me. I was like, how? Like James Earl Jones didn't get a Best Supporting Actor nomination for one of these many great films he was in the
Yeah.
last 60 years. Kind of surprising that was his only one. But this would be the first of 4 Oscar nominations for Jane Alexander. She would be nominated over the next 15 years for All the President's Men and Kramer versus Kramer, which is a great movie with Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep. Jane Alexander has a supporting role in that. And she got one final nomination for a movie called Testament, which she got a nomination in the leading category. So that was a surprise to me too. Like I'm kind of aware of her career, but I did not realize that she had been nominated 4 times, which is pretty cool. Yeah. So those are all my tidbits of background info. Let's see. Anything else that I came across? I guess the movie was not a financial success. It lost money. It didn't, even though it had all that success on the stage, it didn't necessarily translate to big box office in 1970. Anything else you read about or wanted to bring up?
I just thought about it in the context of when it was released and how many movie theaters would have carried a show that had a mixed relationship in it, presented there's a bedroom scene, there's all kinds of things that might not have, because I'm thinking back to the 90s when shows like that were released and there were protests, outside of movie theaters.
Mm-hmm.
That was the 90s. I don't think that the 70s, were more progressive. So I imagine, that was a hard sell to movie theaters as well. So probably stood out in its time for what it was doing and what it was presenting.
Yeah, I would imagine that some of the cities or maybe even some of the states, right, would not show the film, and that might have hurt its box office. 3 years before this, there was a film called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Have you heard of that movie?
I've heard of it. I haven't watched it.
It's about an interracial relationship, and it's a little bit more, like, it's got a little bit more comedy in it. It's like not quite as serious as this film is, but it's Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn are the parents, and their white daughter comes home to show them the man she's about to marry, and it's Sidney Poitier. So that was kind of like an influential film about interracial relationships 3 years before in 1967. But this one's a little bit different. So yeah, just what did you think of it overall? Like, kind of what was your take on the movie? What did you think?
I was super interested in the beginning. It starts out with this idea of the Great White Hope, like you said, and all of these officials in the boxing, arena thinking about how they're going to get Jackson out of his role, or Jack. I want to call him Jack Johnson because that's his real name. But
it's
Jack
always
Jeffries.
Yeah. Exactly.
So the name. But try to get Jeffries out of the belt, or out of the championship. But he actually wins it, and I think it's interesting that we don't see that match.
Yeah, why don't we see very much boxing in this movie? Did you wonder about that?
Yeah, so that match is like completely left out, so we don't get to see him win the championship belt.
Yeah,
and actually it returns to, it moves directly from him winning, which we don't really know happens until you see the belt and he's getting the flowers and things, and he's back in Chicago. And he's at the restaurant that he owned in Chicago, which isn't exactly made clear in the movie either. But if you know the history of the original boxer, you know that he did own that cafe restaurant type thing. And it's one of the first mixed race cafe bar type places.
Interesting.
So it was a interracial cafe. So that was different as well. But that was interesting to me that we don't see that match at all. So we don't get to see this guy who came out of retirement get beat.
It was such a weird directorial choice for me to not show that. I mean, the movie's only 100 minutes, so it's not a matter of the movie was running long. We needed to cut a couple boxing scenes. So yeah, kind of weird, because we do get, I want to try to avoid like every spoiler of the movie, right? So we talk about what happens to the two leads at the end. We'll for anyone who wants to go out and find this movie, I don't want to give away everything. But we do end with a long boxing scene at the end that goes on and on and on. And I was kind of curious, like, why have that extended boxing scene at the end which obviously is important to the story, but then to
Right.
not have, I mean, we get I think a little bit of him practicing earlier on, but we don't really get any other matches, which I found kind of a unique directorial choice.
Yeah, that's the only one. And it is, in an hour and a half, like you said, it's a pretty quick progression of what happens, and to not have those boxing scenes is
Hmm.
interesting. Which is also, because one of my complaints about the ending and how it ends, and I won't spoil it,
Hmm.
but um, there's not a lot of room for complexities of the characters. So I found that the end could be read as wrapped up in a way that white audiences might appreciate,
Okay. Hmm.
or be able to point to, see, that's the lesson
Yeah.
um, for this, and because the character, there wasn't a lot of growth or understanding of the character's complexities. I don't think that the movie gave enough of that
Hmm.
for that ending to be appreciated. Um,
Yeah, it is an interesting thought. Like, the audiences this was made for in 1970, there probably was some thinking going into that. Like, how do we end this story? How does, especially since probably most of the audiences that will be seeing this particular film would probably have been white in 1970, maybe that thought of like, how do we end this to make them happy? Probably went
yeah,
into some of the storytelling and directorial choices for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Anything
And
else?
I'd have to read the play to know, if it, how
Yeah,
closely that
yeah.
matches up. But
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to look at the play. I'd be curious to see how the play ends and if it's different. One thing I did note about this movie, I've seen a lot of films that are based on plays, and 95% of the time, like within 20 minutes, this was based on a play. Like there's a lot of like sets and people talking in rooms, and even if I don't know it was, like, usually I'm like, oh, this is probably a play. This film I thought was a little bit more open than your typical stage adaptation into a film. Like, I felt like there was a little bit more cinematic touches to this movie than you normally see. I don't know if you noticed that, or if you felt the same or differently, but I thought that was kind of an interesting aspect to the film that didn't feel super claustrophobic or closed in
yeah,
ever, right? Like, we get outside that montage of them, just being romantic out on the field, and
yeah,
like it's more open than your typical film that's based on a stage play.
yeah, definitely. Even when they were in Europe, you get the scenery and the the landscape. So it isn't. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
I
so
see
that,
that
yeah,
too.
so that just made me wonder, what did this look like on the stage? Like, I mean, they go to a lot of places, there's a lot of sets and
Yeah,
locations in the film. I'm like, how does this work on the stage?
yeah. How many
I'm curious.
acts was the play?
17 acts, starting with the first one.
Yes.
Yeah. Anything
Yeah,
else we
that is
liked
interesting.
or disliked about the movie, just kind of in general, before we get to themes? Anything else, like performances or anything that you admired?
Um, I think that, I mean, definitely James Earl Jones. There were definite moments in the film where you can see that he is balancing between the idea that white people are mad at him for being a black boxer and winning,
Hmm.
and also black people are mad at him for not being their hope, like
Mm.
they wanted, but he didn't. He tells the one kid, if you're expecting me to be your hope, in that scene when they're in Reno, which was super
Yeah, wasn't
interesting.
that weird?
Yeah,
That was like mind blowing to me when they go to Reno, and
yeah,
like, so that's what it looked like in 1910.
yeah. Did it look that
No,
way? Yeah.
I
Um,
looked it up, and I didn't see. I don't think they shot in Reno, so I think they used Arizona for most of the filming.
yeah.
So I don't think they actually went to Reno for that.
But
Yeah.
they, before he goes to box in that match, they're standing out there and they're talking to him, and the minister's like, I'm praying for you, and there's that scene where he's like, don't, pray for me. I'm not your hope. And so he's balancing in between those two different things, and I think you can tell that um, by the way he speaks, and by the way the awkwardness is just palatable when he's in those moments of balancing in between that.
Mhm.
So you can feel that tension. So I think he does a really great job of that.
Yeah,
So
for
same
sure.
thing with Alexander. She does the same thing when she's in the scene where she goes to talk to the district attorney, and she's trying to um, maintain a certain amount of, uh, privacy, I guess.
Hmm.
And she's also trying to defend her relationship. She does the same thing. So,
Yeah, that was one of my favorite scenes of the movie. Actually, she acts opposite Hal Holbrook, who is a great Oscar nominated actor who I've seen in many films throughout the years. He's in Creepshow and uh, some other films that I've really enjoyed. And I thought that scene had a nice energy to it. It showed kind of her agency. It wasn't like he pursued her. Jack
mhm.
didn't. He didn't pursue her. She was kind of the one interested in him, and she went after him. And I thought the movie needed that scene to really give us some context as to her character and their relationship. I thought that was really important.
Well,
Yeah.
and two, the agency is doubled, not only in revealing that she pursued the relationship, but that she goes to the DA and wants to make a statement in order to help out Jack's case. So, I think that's important too, that she's going to stand up to these men, and
Hmm.
she definitely um, finishes that scene uh, on top.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say overall, I liked the film. I admired the film. I felt like it could have been more focused at times, and I almost wanted more scenes with Jack and Eleanor. There were some moments where we would go away from them to other characters. And if the film was 2.5 hours long, I'd maybe be okay with that. But since the film is a fairly brief running time, at 100 minutes for a drama, that's pretty short for a drama. I wondered if the film could have been a little bit more about the two protagonists than having, at least 4 scenes, or I want to say, or more, where we go to other kind of side characters, and I wasn't quite sure why we needed all of
Yeah.
those in relation to, because we really don't get a whole lot of just the two of them together throughout the running time, and I wanted more of that. I really loved them together. I would say my favorite scene is their last scene where they're arguing, and he's pushing her away. That scene had so much energy, and I wanted more scenes like that. I felt like the movie was lacking some of that kind of
Yeah.
energy.
I think that you're hitting on the same thing that I felt was like we didn't get the complexities of
Hmm.
the characters. And so that's why it made the ending feel so like it just felt like the movie was trying to push a moral, not
Yeah, yeah.
morals, but like a this is what happens. And now and so that's how it felt to me, because we didn't get to see enough of who the characters actually were and what was motivating them or driving them to do the things that they were doing.
Yeah, even just another 10 to 15 minutes that showed us a little bit more motivation, especially on behalf of Jack. And like, there were some moments I wrote down in my note. I was like, wait, how did we get here? Like, it's almost like they left out some information that we needed as the viewer.
Yeah.
So I don't know, again, if that all of that I was looking for was in the stage play or not. I don't know. So yeah, so themes, issues of gender, race, identity, the time that this movie came out. It's kind of interesting, right? This is a 50-year-old movie that is about something happening 110 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like if this film were set in 1970, it would have been very, very different. But even in 1970, right? I mean,
Right.
interracial marriage. I think what you could get married in 1970, right? If it was, I think but it was pretty, like, the Supreme Court.
I
Uh,
want to say,
if not
yeah,
in 1970, close to 1970.
yeah.
So it was still a controversial subject. So to look at that from, another 60 years in the past, I thought that was kind of, a unique way to get into to these themes that the film is dealing with. So what themes did you kind of see in the film?
I mean, they're definitely, thinking about miscegenation laws, and like they include the Mann Act,
Hmm.
um, things like that. They kind of delve into a little bit of the gambling um,
Oh yeah.
uh,
Hmm.
scene with boxing and things like that. And there's an interesting history there that when the actual boxer was boxing, the president, Teddy Roosevelt, was a fan of boxing until he started winning, and then pushed to not have his prize fight recordings
Hmm.
um, go across state lines because it could promote violence or things like
Oh,
that, which I
okay.
think is interesting also because the feds follow him, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we don't really think about, I mean, that seems preposterous that a federal agent would follow someone to another country and watch them, like spy on them, because they were in a relationship with somebody. That seems
Yeah.
like just absurd today. I mean, not really with all context and history included, but it's still, it's a federal agent, like that's interesting,
Yeah.
that's happening, and how they believe, there's that one scene where they're trying to get him to throw the match, and the federal agents like, this is population control, and they believe that, definitely, like sports and things like that influenced how the population was going to respond in some way socially, not about sports,
Mm-hmm.
like socially, and wanted to damper that confidence that the boxer was providing, which I think we see today. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, the same kind of things are working, which which makes me sound kind of like a conspiracy theorist person, when I say this, but I mean, like now I wonder like what's going on behind the scenes, like when we think about all of how the ways sports are engaging, in politics right now, and in people's responses, like politically, what are they doing in the background?
Yeah, for sure.
Because that's interesting. But I mean, I thought that was a major theme of
Mm-hmm.
it, was what the government was doing and what they were thinking about what people were doing in response to a sport, which
Mm-hmm.
is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just, going after what's right. I mean, this is something that he's really gifted at. This is something he's worked hard for, and he's just got, in the face of so much adversity, right? You have like, black people and white people kind of against him for different reasons, but and he has this woman who he loves who just happens to be of another race, but he pushes forward anyway, at least for a while. And up until the point where he feels like he's about to break. Right? So
Yeah.
Stories about people like that who persevere under harsh circumstances, I'm drawn to, and I thought there was a lot of that in this movie too. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. He continues, even when it feels like she's already given up too.
Mm-hmm.
He keeps pushing, which culminates in that scene that you were talking about where they're
Mm-hmm.
fighting.
Yeah. But I thought the film is interesting. It doesn't shy away from their relationship. I mean, I wrote down that the very first scene with them, like they're kissing. Like it's not like
Mhm.
it's not
Yeah.
like it's something that the audience kind of has to be, And Guess
Yeah.
Who's Coming to Dinner, which came out 3 years before, I don't think they kiss in the beginning. Like I think it's later in the movie.
Yeah.
You have to like prepare the audience a little bit. But in this one, they're just a couple,
Yeah.
and it's all good, and she's on board, and that scene where she's like, yeah, I went after him. I think I find him pleasing, or what did she say at that point?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought that was kind of an interesting way to go too. So let's talk about the director. Any directorial choices you thought about the movie? I've touched on a little bit. I mean, it's kind of hard if you don't know the work of a director. I wouldn't say Martin Ritt is an auteur, right? The same way that like Alfred Hitchcock or John Ford or Stanley Kubrick is, like where they really put like their stamp on a movie, where you can basically watch any of their films and 10 minutes in, you go, oh, that's a Hitchcock film. Like,
Yeah.
I think Martin Ritt was one of these directors who made really solid films, but he just told the story, and not that there's anything wrong with that. A lot of great filmmakers do that. Rob Reiner, who made Stand By Me, which you brought up earlier, Rob Reiner made one great film after another for almost 10 years, I want to say. He did This Is Spinal Tap, and then he did Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, which you mentioned, and then he did When Harry Met Sally, a romantic comedy. Then he made Misery, a horror film. All of these great films. Does he have like a directorial stamp on these films? Not the same way that someone like
Yeah.
Hitchcock might. But did you notice anything about like the look of the film, or anything that you thought maybe the director was putting a stamp on the movie at all? Anything that you noticed, like
Uh,
the way like scenes played out, or editing, or anything like that?
I would say that it moved fairly quickly,
Yeah.
between scenes, but I don't know enough about the director to know, how what other movies that he did looked like. It did, you know, like you were out of one place and into another one
Hmm.
fairly quickly. And so you had to kind of get your bearings and know what was where we were.
Yeah, would it tell you, like, it wouldn't really, you know, like some films, especially modern films, if a
Right,
character goes to different places, like it'll say Mexico
right.
on the screen. But
I think it
yeah,
was obvious that we were in Reno. That was the
Reno, there was like the
first.
big banner.
Yes, yes. That was, but we knew that they were going there.
Yeah,
But it took me a long time to figure out that they were in San Francisco,
yeah,
which makes sense because he wouldn't have been able to stay in Reno. So when he was practicing, he was in San Francisco, but everybody else was already in Reno because they were
yeah.
white and they could be in Reno.
Hmm.
And then when they moved to Chicago, it took me a long time to place that because that felt like what I think of Reno, you know, like maybe that's an early casino. There's all these lights and glitz and glamour and everybody's dressed up, you know. And then I was like, nope, we are definitely in Chicago. How did I miss that?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's hard, right? Because this is
yeah,
they're shooting this film probably in 1969 for a 70 release, and they're shooting it in 69, but all the locations are from the early part of the 20th century. So
right,
you're not going to necessarily recognize like
right.
what city they're in unless it's super
Yeah,
obvious, right?
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, when he got to Europe, it was easier because the other characters were speaking, you know, in
Yeah.
different languages, so that helped a little bit. But yeah,
Yeah, this was the case of a film. I think a little bit more of a directorial stamp would have made the movie better. Like, I think if we had gotten a little bit more inside Jack's head, like a little
yeah,
bit more point of view work, you know, it's hard to compare them because they're so different. But I was thinking a lot about Raging Bull. I don't know if you've seen that film with Robert De Niro, directed by
mhm,
Martin Scorsese, you know, about a boxer. And so much of what I love about Raging Bull are the quiet moments where you really get inside Robert De Niro's head, Jake LaMotta. Whereas this movie, most of the scenes are shot in a kind of just generic way where the camera's just kind of locked on sticks
mhm.
on the side of the set, you know, and people talk. And there are, I mean, a couple nice moments, like as I said before, that little montage of them, you know, having a romantic outing.
Mhm.
That's followed by them in bed, and I believe the camera just stays on them, just kind of like whispering to each other for at least a
Yeah,
minute. Um, the last film I talked about in this podcast called Monty Walsh, a Western, also did the same thing. Had a shot in the movie where the main character and the woman he loves are on a bed talking, kind of, you know, kissing each other, and this camera stays on them for more than a minute, minute and a half, and it's kind of like this something that you don't really see in films of today, where you can like allow the characters just to exist on the screen and not feel like every 5 seconds we got to cut to the next shot, cut to
yeah.
the next scene, get the movie going. Um, so I like that about it. But yeah, you know, as someone, I've made films before. I went to film school. I'm always kind of looking for, okay, you know, where's the director in this movie? Is he just kind of like this invisible force behind the camera that you don't want to see him at all? Sometimes, depending on the story, that's okay. But this one, I thought he could have inserted, you know, his beliefs,
Yeah.
a little bit of his style into the film a little bit more than I could
I think
see.
at the end I did notice, which I think helped think kind of about the motivations or what was going on in the end in that end match. Definitely the camera focused more in on his face.
Hmm.
It wasn't just the wide,
Yeah.
let's watch the boxing match. Um,
Yeah.
and so it was focusing on the trauma that he was experiencing, which,
Hmm.
you know, added to all of the trauma that led up to that match. Um,
Yeah.
as he's in that match. So I think that was a good choice there. I wish
Hmm.
I think I wish there was more of that where we can see, you know, kind of what's going on with him as a character and what he's doing besides just the let's watch him get pummeled, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that. I think there is a moment towards the end of that final boxing match where the sound kind of goes out, and I don't think it does slow motion, but we get like a close up of his face, and he's looking out at the crowd, and
Hmm.
we get a little bit inside of his head. I think that's maybe 30 to 40 seconds. So I really like that.
Yeah.
But I felt like there might have been a better setup for that. I felt like the last boxing scene would have had more energy, would have had more at stake if we had gotten at least one other boxing scene earlier in the movie,
Right.
you know, or the kind of the rule of three, right? Maybe start the film with one and then have one towards the middle where maybe he just kind of, you know, just takes the guy out and, oh, he, you know, he's going to win them all, right? And then in the end, where we like really kind of like feel for him and like what's going to happen at the end of this match, it was a very unique choice to not have any boxing scenes before the end. And
Well,
I wish I could talk to Martin.
it
Why
is
did you do this?
interesting too. At the beginning, we do get a boxing scene as the credits are rolling.
Yeah.
But it's only the feet. And so you
Yeah,
only
that's
get to
right.
see the dance of the boxers, but you don't, and then you see one fall, but you don't really get to see the match either there. So that's interesting that that's the choice. And we don't even know if that's the boxers that are in the movie. That's just what, yeah.
They got an extra on set. But yeah, I mean, three great boxing movies came to mind as I watched this. I thought of Raging Bull, I thought of Rocky, and I thought of $1 Million Baby. Three movies that I love, and those films have like lots of boxing scenes. Although all three are also about the human story and the relationship of the main character, and they're about a lot more than the boxing. But you get these occasional scenes where you can kind of see them training and getting better. And, so yeah, it was just kind of an interesting choice that it's probably not him, right? It's probably just based on the script.
And we do get to see him train, which kind of, but there it lacks too, I felt, because it should be building the relationship between him and his trainer a little bit, but we don't really get to see how that relationship plays out until they get to Europe, and then you get to see kind of how involved the trainer is with his fiance and things like that. So that's different.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's talk just briefly about performances. You talked about Jones a little bit, but why do you think James Earl Jones and Jane Alexander, why do you think they got Oscar nominations for this movie? Anything else that they did in the film that you thought was really outstanding or kind of noteworthy? Or they're just their presence. I thought Jones's presence in this movie, I'm like, damn, I mean, I wish this man had more leading roles in movies. He really doesn't. He's usually a side character,
and he has an amazing presence.
Oh my gosh.
When I was thinking about other movies that he was in, and then he's just usually got a small role, like even Sandlot, which I think of because I feel like Sandlot is like the PG version of Stand By Me. Definitely, but he's only at the end, but it's important. And when he talks to the boys in that scene is just as important as when he talks to Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams, that speech we remember. And then in The Lion King, when he's Mufasa and he's talking to Simba from the clouds, like all of those things. And he has that presence. And that presence is visible in this movie. And it's especially interesting to me because he's younger. And I only know him really from, an older,
80s, 90s.
From an older perspective. So he carries that, in that voice. I wouldn't say, it's the same kind of feeling as when I hear like Morgan Freeman's voice or, but it is kind of, like, I mean, they each have that commanding voice about them. And you can see that in the movie.
Maybe the presence is almost so commanding that to have it like for an entire movie, it's almost like overbearing, or maybe it's almost like too much. Like sometimes, like because he'll be in just a couple scenes of a film, and his performance is what I'll be thinking about when it's over, even though he's only in 10 minutes, right? So he seems to have made a career of that, where he's just kind of like a little part of the film, but he's kind of like your biggest takeaway or what you're thinking about at the end. And so it was like a really special experience to see him kind of lead a movie. I don't think I've ever seen him like the leading actor in a film. And every time he was on screen, I was captivated. And that's why I'd be disappointed when we'd go to other characters in a film of such a short length. I'm like, no, just stay with Jones. Like, let's have him be our point of view character all the way through. I think I would have liked that more. I don't know.
I agree. And I think that, like in the other movies where he's just the smaller role, he comes in and he lays down the edict for the rest of the, like, it's like, this is what you're going to do. And then they all do it because he said so. And so you're like, okay, James Earl Jones told me I'm going to do this thing, and now I'm going to do it. And so, I think, I don't know.
Yeah. And then Jane Alexander, I was kind of curious that why she didn't get a Best Supporting Actress nomination, because she's not in the film as much as he is. She got the supporting actress for the Tony Award on stage. She got not the leading actress Tony, but the supporting actress, which is called featured actress. So that was kind of interesting to me. I'm as you can probably tell by now, I'm like an Oscar aficionado. I'm always curious about these awards and how they go. And it's like, well, why did he get leading actor, or why did she get supporting actress and not? And this was a case where I was curious, maybe because she's just like the one really major lead female of the movie. But in terms of like running time, I wouldn't say she's in a whole lot of the film to warrant a leading actress in a film. But regardless, I thought she was really great. I thought it does not feel like a debut performance on film. Like her last scene in the movie is just electric. Like her, the way her emotions keep changing and evolving. I mean, I want to say that scene's 5 minutes or more. It's a long scene. I mean, that was the moment I thought, okay, this is why she got nominated. Was this part. Like this, like before that, she's got some great moments and everything, but that's where she's just like really emotional at that end, that last scene that she's in. And I thought she did a great job too.
Yeah, even when she's just standing there with the Coke bottle glasses on, leaned against the wall, you can tell her body language is saying something about how she feels about that situation and the moment that they're in. And she does a really good job. She does a really good job of that too when they're in Europe and she's sitting at the table and he makes her uncomfortable.
Yeah. So any other actors? I mean, I wasn't aware of pretty much anyone else in the movie except for Hal Holbrook, who was in. I couldn't think of the title before, but my favorite performance of his is in a film called Into the Wild, which came out in 2007. Yeah, he's been around for many, many years, and I think he's only in that one scene, across the room from Jane Alexander, her character Eleanor, and I thought he was a welcome presence in the movie.
Is he the one sitting behind her, or is he the one?
He's the one who she's talking to. Like he's on the other side of the desk. Yeah. So he's been around for a long time. He's been in a lot of great films. But yeah, I mean, in terms of some of the other actors in the film, there wasn't like any real standout performances. I think her name's B. Richards, who played his mom. I think she just had that one scene in the film. She won the NAACP award for Best Supporting Actress in a Film of 1970 for this movie. And I'm like, for one scene, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I love these stories.
Yeah, it wasn't super long either. Yeah. And that scene was super interesting in terms of, thinking about the female actresses or female actors in the movie. Because the first love interest gets sat on and silenced by the whole crowd. I think that scene was super interesting.
Yeah, but that's another actress. I think she had a pretty long career, a lot of like interesting material. But I'm always like intrigued by these actors. They probably did a day, right? They did a day of work on a film, and then a year and a half later, or whatever it is, they get an award. It's like, that's kind of neat. One day, Ned Beatty, who has a small role in one of my favorite films of the 70s called Network. I don't know if you've heard of or seen Network. He talks about how he did one day of work on that movie and he got an Academy Award nomination. So it's always like, that's crazy to me. That's why every role counts. When you're a young actor, when you're starting out, anything you can take, I mean, sometimes it'll, 90% of the time it turns into nothing, but sometimes it can be, a really important role in a great film. So. All right. Any other thoughts on The Great White Hope? My final question, which I ask of every guest about our film, is just, looking at this film through a 2020 lens, kind of like in terms of the story or in terms of, the way it was put together, the way it was filmed, anything about the film you found dated at all? And like, if this movie were made today, like, how would it be different? Like, how would the director, how would the screenwriter, like how what would they bring to it in 2020 that maybe you couldn't do in 1970? Or, I mean, obviously some of the language in the film you wouldn't be able to probably have today. Like like the first 10 minutes, I'm like, oh my God, couldn't really do this. I mean, maybe, it would depend because it is a period film. So
Yeah, I didn't really think about the language in the beginning because I feel like some movies do that because it is a period film.
Yeah.
But like when she's in the DA office and it gets bleeped out in the version that I watched, but I know exactly what she said.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
I was like, this would be like rated. I don't know what this would be rated. Definitely R for sure,
Hmm.
because of what they're saying. Um, but yeah, as far as yeah, I think like you brought up some good points about. I did like the bedroom scene, but there are a lot less of like thinking about and closing in on the characters. And probably I'm wondering, like what was the budget for this film
Hmm.
and how many cameras did they have and were they, like just trying to film it and like
Get through the day.
yeah,
Yeah.
and get it done, or if there was like the technology to zoom in on those things because you really don't need like
Mm.
a lot of stuff,
Hmm.
like I mean there's no lights and things like that you need for it. There's no it's not like Star Wars. We don't need like noises and zooms or anything.
He turns into Vader at the end of The Great White
Yeah.
Hope. That would have been a different ending.
um but I think like maybe having different types of cameras where there are quick cuts
Okay. So you wanted a little bit more variety
yeah
in the look of the film and the angles
yeah
and things. Yeah, that's something you don't get as much in like films of the 60s and 70s. You don't when two people are talking in a scene, you're not going to get a whole lot of coverage. Whereas in a film today,
sure.
if you really study a 2-minute scene of two people talking, usually there's like a close-up, extreme close-up,
Hmm.
wide, establishing, two-shot. Like they shoot it from like 8 different ways, and then in the editing room they kind of
Right.
mix it up. And whereas a lot of the older films, even just 50 years ago, they would shoot a scene from maybe 2 angles and then that's it. So
Yeah, and you can tell,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah.
In terms of like if this film were made today, I was thinking, the good thing about it today, they'd probably focus more on their relationship if the film was made today. And I think the bad thing would be it'd be more pedestrian boxing movie. I think it would be told a little bit more just kind of like generic, kind of boxing, similarly trying to make it more like Rocky, trying to make it a little bit more like upbeat,
Yeah.
whereas sometimes I actually like, when the movie's not just, it doesn't have your typical happily ever after at the end. I'm always
Yeah.
kind of intrigued, by filmmakers who will take more chances and not just give us what we expect from a film like this. So I think I think there'd be good and bad aspects, like if the story were made today. But yeah. So yeah, anything else about the film you wanted to mention? Any other scenes we missed? I feel like I touched on all the major scenes I wanted to talk about. Anything else you'd like to say about The Great White Hope before we move to our final 2 segments?
I think that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, if I were to tell our listeners to check it out, I think if you're at all a fan of James Earl Jones, I think this is a film worth looking at. Like I've always been a fan of his, even though most of the films I've seen him in are in supporting roles. The film nerd in me was very excited to see him kind of play a lead. So I thought that alone made this film
Yeah.
worth watching. But was it a great film? No, I wouldn't tell people this film it's one of the 10 best of 1970. It's really, really astonishing. I wouldn't say that, right? I would say I admired it. I liked the performances, but it's not one of the better films. I've been looking at 1970 films since January because it's like my project is I spend a year looking at films 50 years ago. Both for this podcast and just for fun on the side. So this isn't one of the better ones I've watched, but it's still worth looking at, especially if you're a fan of James Earl Jones. So that takes us to a segment I'm calling the Divine Double Feature. And this is where we pick a more contemporary film that you think would make for like a nice second film to watch after The Great White Hope. So what film were you thinking of? If you were to sit down with this film and another movie, what would you go with?
Okay, so mine is not obvious, and I think, I did think, you mentioned Rocky and the other boxing films,
Yeah.
Million Dollar Baby and things like those, and I didn't think that it hit in the same complexities. For me, those movies didn't, as far as the relationship that we quite didn't get fully to see, but how the world was working
Mm-hmm.
around them. So what it reminded me of, and this is strange, was the fight scene in Black Panther on the waterfall.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
because, and it might be because we just lost Chadwick Boseman,
Chadwick, yeah.
but I think about it because T'Challa fights M'Buka, M'Baku. I don't know how to pronounce his
Hmm.
name. I'm sorry. The first guy that he fights, played by Winston Duke.
Okay.
Um, and they follow tradition, and everything seems to work out, right? The main character everything proceeds as it should, right? Even
Hmm.
though there's conflict. But then when Eric Stevens comes in, played by Michael B. Jordan,
Hmm.
Killmonger, he does not follow tradition, and everything falls apart for both the main character and for everything around them.
Hmm.
And what I was thinking about was him as the boxer trying to he's just like, you know what? If I can get out of this country and just keep boxing and being in the ring and doing what I'm supposed to be doing, then everything's going to be fine.
Oh, that is an interesting connection. Yeah.
And it doesn't work
Hmm.
because there's so many other parts at play, and tradition doesn't get followed, because they have ulterior motives, and so did Killmonger. He had, these ulterior motives for revenge. And so I thought about it in that way, in those, how those fight scenes, um, which we don't get as many fight scenes, but the idea of the goal of those fights and what they're supposed to do and what they end up not doing, um, because they realize tradition just falls
Hmm.
apart, and how easily it can fall apart.
Yeah, that's a fascinating choice. I really love what you had to say about Black Panther there, and and it's something that I would find to be interesting because you're looking at a film made in 1970 and then a film made fairly recently that came out in 2018, so 2 years ago, to see kind of how film has evolved over the last 50 years too, just to see how storytelling has changed so much in the last 5 decades. Um, which is why when I think of like a double feature, to maybe watch this movie with say a film that came out in 77 or something, it might not have the same kind of resonance. To think of like this double feature project as like watching a film made 50 years ago and then a film made in the last 5 to 10 years. Like, you're going to see a lot of different styles and directorial stamps. And Black Panther, what a great film that is, and what a loss it's been to to lose Chadwick Boseman, one of my favorite actors of the last few years. That is just such a great film, and I love the idea of pairing that with The Great White Hope for sure. Issues of race and gender, and
Well, and there's
yeah.
also, like the complexities of what, a government stands for, and what a government
Mm.
is doing, and what they're trying to do, and him learning from his sister, in Black Panther, the same way he's learning
Hmm.
from his fiance, and things like that. So
Hmm.
we just don't get to see enough of it, I think.
Yeah.
And I also, it made me think about like how we put so much into sports figures and actors, and
Hmm.
things like that, and we think that we get to be allowed inside of all of their lives. And I think that's why I was thinking about the Black Panther too, because Chadwick Boseman was in it, and then
Hmm.
when he died, everybody was like, well, we didn't even know, and we should,
Hmm.
like, even when RBG died, like, everybody was like, well, this, like, we should have, known these things. But
Hmm.
also then we're like, but they shouldn't speak politically or do these things when they do speak out politically. So it kind of all was kind of surrounded in all of that, like how that works out, and what we remember and what we choose to allow out of these figures. And he's definitely playing a figure that's pivotal
Hmm.
in what Black people are imagining themselves as, and how they're actually feeling about him,
Hmm.
because he's with a white woman.
Yeah,
They're giving,
exactly.
he's doing two things,
Hmm.
giving them hope because he's, winning these matches, and
Hmm.
as a hero, but they're also upset, with him because he's dating a white woman,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
engaged and married to a white woman.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So yeah, I thought I'd pick a boxing film. Like, I thought maybe Million Dollar Baby, but that's a little bit more contemporary. But I felt like if you were to watch Million Dollar Baby after this, it wouldn't put The Great White Hope in a good light, because it's Million Dollar Baby is such a better film, at least in terms of the boxing matches. So I thought of going with a little bit more, traditional route with another film about interracial marriage and relationships, which I really loved. It came out in 2016. It's called Loving. Have you heard of that film? It came out 4 years ago. And it's the true story of Richard and Mildred Loving, a couple who got arrested for interracial marriage in 1960s Virginia.
I have heard of it. Yes.
Yeah, and that's what led to the Supreme Court decision in the late.
There's a Loving, the Loving decision.
Yeah, and the Loving decision, and their last name is Loving, and that's the title of the movie. And when I went to see it, I didn't really know much about it, and it's one of those films that just kind of takes you away right from the first scene, and really well directed by Jeff Nichols, who has made some really terrific films like Take Shelter. And Ruth Negga, who plays Mildred in the film, she got an Oscar nomination for Best Actress. And it's just a fascinating story, very well told, beautifully shot. Also about also a period film, right, of an interracial marriage, an interracial relationship. So in terms of that theme, I thought these would be two interesting films to watch back to back on kind of a subject matter that carries from one film to the next. I thought would be a good double feature.
It did make me think, the Rocky movies, I thought about how they responded, he's fighting the Russian boxer, in those similar ways, how this is working. It made me think about wrestling, because they always had the stereotypical characters and things like that, and how sports influences the public, so much.
Yeah, for sure.
Or can, yeah.
It just brought to mind, I should have looked it up before we recorded this, but there is a 90s film with Samuel L. Jackson called The Great White Hype. Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it, and I've never seen that one.
And as we were sitting there talking, I'm like, does that have something to do with The Great White Hope? I'll have to look it up after this.
Yes.
I was maybe it is a boxing film or something. I didn't see it when it came out, but so that takes us to our last segment, which is I'm calling Beyond the Flick, where we pick a figure or a genre represented by the film and kind of go a little bit beyond the movie by talking about a career, or a genre that the film is affiliated with. So I thought for this one, since he is the lead, I thought we'd talk about James Earl Jones to wrap things up. So kind of what has been your experience watching James Earl Jones movies throughout the years? I know we've talked about him a lot throughout this podcast episode, but what are your 2 or 3 favorite films that he's in, and just say a little bit about his performance in those movies?
Well, I think first, he's from Arcabutla, Mississippi.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's where he was born, and I'm from the South, so I have to, I like to plug how all of the good writers and actors come from the South. But he moved to Jackson, Michigan, in the Great Migration, and was traumatized by the move and stuttered really bad. And an English teacher, which should be close to both of us, found out that he was an excellent poet and understood poetry, and he overcame his stuttering through that. And before that, he had been a mute for 8 years or so, I think. So he overcame all of that with the help of his English teacher and poetry. So I think that that's an important background to understand for James Earl Jones. He's also a military veteran too. So he's had an interesting life. But as far as movies, I mentioned The Sandlot, and he's really just there at the end, but really does make the movie. I like The Sandlot because, like I said before, it reminds me so much of Stand By Me. The narration is the same. You get the point of view from an adult that was one of the boys, and he goes through the story, and then you learn what happened. You follow along with them as they're narrating. But he comes in at the end and kind of fixes everything and imparts wisdom, which I feel is the same, in The Lion King and in Field of Dreams. I feel like he does the the same thing in all three of those movies. But I think my most favorite thing that I've seen him perform in is actually a play, which
Okay.
is August Wilson's Fences.
Oh, he did
And
Fences. Okay.
he was, and I don't want to say that he won awards, but I don't see how he couldn't have. But he was Troy, the father in Fences. And if you've ever seen the scene where Troy is talking to his son Corey, and Corey comes up to him and is like, "Do you like me?" Um, the way that he does it, and you should compare it because Denzel Washington reprised the role
Yeah. So
for
yeah,
Broadway.
I saw the film version of Fences with Denzel. Yeah.
So you should you can look it up on YouTube. You should
It's on
look at the
YouTube.
difference. Yeah, you can look at the difference between that scene. Just Google something like Troy talks to Corey about liking him or something
Okay.
like that.
Mhm.
And look at the version compare the version between Denzel Washington and between James Earl Jones.
Okay.
And I feel like the way that he talks and the mannerisms and the way that we see his facial expressions and the sincerity of emotions that you get from watching him in that play is the same thing that you get in this movie. And I feel like that's not only, like his commanding presence, but the sincerity of emotion is what makes him why he should have got nominated in this movie.
Yeah. So you watched that performance on YouTube? How did you see that? Him and Fences.
I've seen clips of it on YouTube,
Okay, clips.
but I watched it not on Broadway, but I don't remember how I accessed it because it's been probably maybe around 10 years since I've seen it.
Okay.
in full, so I don't remember how I accessed it, but since then I did like a academic paper on the play.
Okay.
And like the different versions and things. So I've revisited just in those clips because that scene where he's talking to his son is a pretty pivotal scene. Which I always
yeah, I'd love to check that out. I really enjoyed the film with Denzel Washington and Viola Davis, and I know that they had performed it on stage before that. I wasn't aware that James Earl Jones had done that role. I would love to see that. So I'm sure I can find it somewhere online.
It's got to be online because I watched it somewhere.
Okay. So if you saw it at some point, that means it's out there. I can find it.
It hasn't disappeared.
Yeah, so I went through this morning. I went through his films, and this has been happening every time. I always want to try to find like kind of like an obscure film of his from like 75 or 82 that no one's ever heard of that I've seen. That's great. I couldn't find one. So yeah, my favorites would be The Sandlot, which is like one of the most timeless movies of the early 90s. Like that came out right around the time I was like 8 or 9 years old. So that obviously left a huge impression on me. I showed it to a group of students, I want to say 1 or 2 years ago. And I was like, I forgot where I was. I was just transported back into that movie again. And his role is so brief at the end. He's like he's blind, right? And he's, he's behind where they play baseball. And like he has maybe 5 to 10 minutes at the end, but he makes such a huge impression. I remember even as a kid, like really, responding to his character and his performance in that movie. So that would definitely be one. And then for voice work, obviously Star Wars and Lion King are super important, not just because of his voice, but like the roles he plays in those films. Like, I mean, that franchise of Star Wars and the Lion King would not be the same without his presence. I think his, the voice he contributed to those, those 2 films, and obviously, more than one film with Star Wars. Well, I guess he also did the voice in the new live action Lion King, which we don't need to talk about. I'm much more of a fan of the animated version of the 90s. But boy, I mean, he, his character dies in Lion King, in the first 20 to 25 minutes. And he is, you feel his presence all throughout that movie, not just because we like see him in the clouds a couple times, but like you just really, gosh, that scene just gutted me when I was a kid, when Simba, finds his father Mufasa dead, after what Scar does. It's like like that Shakespearean scene in the movie. He just his voice just creates something that I don't think any other actor can. I mean, maybe, Morgan Freeman obviously has done a lot of great voice work, but James Earl Jones just has a voice like no other. And then the other film I wrote down was his feature film debut, which was Dr. Strangelove by director Stanley Kubrick. Came out in 1964. So 6 years before he did The Great White Hope, he made his film debut in Dr. Strangelove, which is one of Stanley Kubrick's best films. I've seen it probably 5 or 6 times. Still haven't made sense of the whole movie. I don't know if you've seen that one, but it's kind of a black and white. It's a black comedy. Peter Sellers plays 3 roles in it. It's a very famous black comedy of the early 60s. And James Earl Jones just has a few scenes in it. I think it's like a fighter pilot, but he's great in that film. Like he pops off the screen, and what a great first film to start with. I'm always intrigued by these actors who, in their very first movie, they're in a classic. Right? A lot of these actors, like the first 5 years, they're in just like they're just in trash. They're just in crap, and they get to be famous, and they get into better projects later on. And it's like, don't look at my IMDb page. don't watch those early films.
I think his stage work before that is what like gave him, because he's just so good, and he's in Broadway plays for a while.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not super aware of that. Was he actively on stage throughout his many decades of like film work? Was he also acting on stage? I wonder if he maybe took a break, because I looked like in the 1980s he was in a ton of movies. Like it's like it goes on forever in the 80s. So he was actively working in film.
Sure, he was doing a lot of Broadway plays, different Broadway plays.
Yeah.
I know of Fences, but I'm pretty sure he was in Othello.
Okay.
I don't know where. That could have been like early on, like when he was in college, but I think I remember that, so that's probably true. So I'm imagining that he was doing both for sure.
Yeah, well,
I don't know how those timelines coincide though, so I can't.
Well, I'm going to go online. I want to research to see. There has to be more leading roles he did in films in this one movie. I mean, he's been in film for 60 years, almost 60 years.
Yeah.
So I would assume maybe in the 70s, maybe he did a couple more, like where he's the lead. I'm going to definitely look into that, and I also want to look into his stage work too, and see if I can even just find some clips online. I would love to see at least like a little glimpse of the kind of work he was doing on stage. That's the hard thing about stage work, right? If nobody films it, it's ephemeral. It's just you do it and it's gone. That's what that's like the magic of movies, is that you do it and then it's forever. So well, thank you, Michelle. This was so much fun. Talking about this movie. Thanks for doing this for me. So just to wrap up here, is there anywhere you want our listeners to find you, or anything you'd like to promote, any projects you're working on that our listeners could maybe support you on or help you out? Anything you want to mention at the end here?
I am so not terrific with Twitter that I don't even know my Twitter handle. I try to post things, so I'm not just promoting what I'm writing on and things like that, but I'm just not a social media person, so I won't even share that. I have done some stuff with the Nevada Humanities recently, more thinking about writing during the period of quarantine and things like that. So if you want to look me up there, you can find me. My manuscript's out, so hopefully hear some stuff about that. I don't guess I said that I'm a poet, so it's all poetry, but I have some stuff that you can Google me. My social media though is just not I'm just not the best at it. I don't, I need to work on it. I try to think of things to post on it. I told my friend I was just going to start the random text messages that I send him that are goofy. I'm just going to post them on Twitter to keep my Twitter active, because I just forget about it. Better with Instagram, because I'm okay with posting pictures of plants and flowers and mountains. But none of those things anybody would be interested in. So,
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Michelle. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for the latest episode of Film at 50. Please give the podcast a 5-star rating and a review, and tell your friends and family. You can find the podcast online at filmat50.com. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can email us at 50yearsagoinfilm@gmail.com. Also, take a look at my Patreon page, which has exclusive bonus episodes every month, at least 2 new bonus episodes every month. So take a look at that. Lots of cool stuff coming up. And so thanks a lot for listening. And until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.